A black businessman, exhausted from a week of meetings, settles into his first-class seat, ready for a quiet flight home. The plane hums with routine, but everything changes when he asks for a simple glass of water. A flight attendant, cold and dismissive, walks past his request twice, serving every other passenger but him. The tension in the cabin thickens as eyes begin to turn toward the unfolding scene. But just 5 minutes later, the situation shifts dramatically. After a quiet but firm confrontation, the flight crew steps in, and the flight attendant is removed right in front of stunned passengers. What happened next not only shocked the entire plane but sparked a ripple effect that no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is more than just a story about water. It's about dignity, resistance, and the moment when silence breaks. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if this resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that matter. It started the way most things do, with the illusion of peace. Darius sat by the window, the stretch of the sky cutting through the clouds like the long road he had traveled to get here. A week of back-to-back meetings left his body tired, but his mind, as always, stayed sharp. First class didn't feel like a luxury to him anymore. It was simply a necessary retreat from the noise of the world. Though even up here, the echoes found him. The plane hummed softly, passengers settling into the quiet rituals of flight. The man beside Darius had already fallen into a book, occasionally glancing over his reading glasses toward the flight attendants. Across the aisle, a woman swiped through movies, the glow of the screen flickering across her face. The world was contained here, a fragile bubble suspended 30,000 feet above the rest of civilization. Darius leaned his head back, letting the cabin lights fade into soft shadows behind his eyelids. He wasn't thinking about much, just the feel of the plane ascending and the rhythmic pulse of engines beneath his seat. For once, there were no immediate demands, no clients waiting for responses. It should have been easy. But things like this are never easy, are they? It began when the flight attendants started their rounds. Darius didn't notice it at first. The blonde woman Meredith, he would later recall, moved through the cabin with ease, her cart clinking as she offered drinks and smiles. But as she neared his row, her gaze flickered past him, landing on the man next to him with a polite nod. Darius didn't expect much. He wasn't one to make demands, especially over something as trivial as water. When the cart rolled by without pause, he simply pressed the call button and waited. A minute passed. 2. He glanced down the aisle. Meredith was laughing softly, pouring a glass of champagne for another passenger 3 rows up. The button light still glowed above him. The moment was small, forgettable, even, but Darius had lived long enough to know that small things grow heavy when ignored. He pressed the button again, watching this time as Meredith stiffened slightly before turning around. Her smile, as she approached, didn't reach her eyes. Yes? Just a glass of water, Darius said, his voice light but clear. Meredith nodded but didn't move immediately. Instead, her gaze flitted across the cabin, as if to confirm there were more pressing matters. I'll get to you, she said quickly, pivoting back toward the other rows. Darius let out a quiet breath and leaned back into his seat. He wasn't the type to dwell. People have bad days, flights are long, but as the minutes passed, he couldn't help but notice the pattern. Meredith's return trips up and down the aisle brought glasses of wine, sodas, and small cups of coffee to every row but his. The water never came. It wasn't about the drink. Not really. Darius could have easily leaned over, asked the other flight attendant Susan, who had been pleasant when he boarded. But that wasn't the point. The point was Meredith's gaze, the tightness of her voice. It was the way she didn't see him. Or worse, the way she did. Another 10 minutes slid by, and Darius felt the slow burn of something he had worked hard to suppress most of his life. He was not loud, he wasn't confrontational, but he wasn't invisible either. So, when Meredith passed by once more, Darius did something he rarely did. He stood. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. The older man reading beside him looked up sharply. The woman across the aisle paused her movie. Meredith stopped mid-step, glancing over her shoulder. "I've been waiting for some water," Darius said, his tone even, controlled. "It's been about 15 minutes. For a second, Meredith didn't speak. A flicker of something passed over her face. The kind of expression Darius had seen many times before. The passengers were watching now, small glances exchange. Unsure of what this was but understanding, on some level, that it wasn't just about water. "I'll bring it when I can," Meredith said finally, brushing past him with an air of finality. But Darius didn't sit. There are moments when the world waits for you to react. When it presses down, testing the limits of your patience, waiting to see if you will yield. Darius didn't yield. "Ma'am," his voice grew firmer, slicing through the polite indifference. "It's just water. I've asked twice." The cabin was quiet now. People weren't just glancing, they were watching. Meredith's steps slowed, her shoulders visibly stiffening. "You need to take your seat," she said, this time with more weight. Darius met her gaze directly. "And you need to bring the water." The air in the cabin thickened, the unspoken tension unraveling thread by thread. He could feel it, the slow tide of discomfort rising in the rows behind him. But Darius wasn't asking for much. It was just water. But, of course, it wasn't. The first few seconds after Darius sat back down felt longer than the entire flight leading up to this moment. The plane's soft hum continued undisturbed. But inside Darius's chest, there was a quiet storm beginning to stir. He could feel the weight of every glance cast his way, the fleeting ones from passengers who quickly looked away when his eyes met theirs, and the lingering ones from those who weren't sure if they were supposed to intervene or pretend nothing was happening. Meredith moved briskly down the aisle, heels clicking against the narrow floor as if the sound alone could drown out what had just transpired. She was quick to serve the next row, leaning forward with practiced ease, smiling at the older white couple seated there. They exchanged polite words about the altitude and the complimentary wine. Darius watched it all carefully, not out of bitterness but with the studied patience of someone who had long been made to wait. This was the sort of thing that didn't need to be loud to be understood. It whispered through the air, creeping in through the smallest cracks in polite society. He had seen it before, in hotel lobbies and boardrooms, in the subtle pauses when hands lingered on wallets a moment too long as he passed by. It was the silence that followed him into department stores. The way his presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere without him ever uttering a word. The issue was never just about the moment itself, it was about the accumulation of moments. And if Darius had learned anything in his 34 years, it was that those moments build like rain. One drop didn't mean much. But wait long enough, and you'd find yourself standing in the flood. He glanced at the overhead screen. 4 hours left in the flight. 4 long hours. Across the aisle, the woman with the movie glanced over again, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. She shifted in her seat, opening her mouth as if to say something but quickly shutting it. Darius exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry at her. She was just another passenger, caught between the impulse to comfort and the fear of drawing attention to herself. And really, what could she say? "I saw that. That wasn't right." It wouldn't change anything. People often saw injustice unfold right in front of them but convinced themselves it was too small to warrant action. After all, it wasn't their battle. But Darius was tired of quiet battles. The call button flickered softly above him, a tiny light against the sterile ceiling. He considered pressing it again, testing the waters to see how long Meredith could ignore him. But he decided against it. He wasn't in the business of begging for respect. Meredith would have to walk by eventually. And she did. 15 minutes later, she came down the aisle with the drink cart. Avoiding Darius's gaze altogether, his eyes followed her closely. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but cutting through the low chatter of the cabin like a blade. The cart halted. Meredith's head turned slightly, but her body didn't follow. She pretended to adjust something on the tray, the lines around her mouth tightening as if she hadn't heard him. "I asked for some water earlier," Darius continued. His tone hadn't changed, but the subtle weight behind it pressed heavier into the space between them. "I'm still waiting." For a moment, it felt as though the entire cabin was holding its breath. Meredith's hand gripped the cart handle. "I told you I'd get to it," she replied, her voice clipped. "You seem to have found time for everyone else," Darius said plainly. Her eyes finally snapped to his. And there it was, the thing no one ever said aloud. The unspoken line that separated him from the rest of the passengers. The same line that followed him everywhere. She opened her mouth to respond, but Darius leaned forward slightly, cutting her off before she could. "It's just water," he said, quieter this time. "It doesn't take much effort to pour a glass." The cabin, once filled with the white noise of conversations and movie screens, had grown unsettlingly still. Darius could feel the collective gaze of passengers drifting toward them, some curious, others uncomfortable. He had become a spectacle without meaning to be. And now there was no turning back. Meredith's face flushed slightly, her professionalism beginning to fray at the edges. "I'll get to it when I can," she said again, this time with enough force to make it clear that the conversation was over. But Darius didn't blink. Neither did the woman 2 rows ahead. "I'll bring it," another voice cut in. Susan, the second flight attendant, emerged from the galley behind Meredith, balancing a glass of water on a small tray. Her smile was thin but sincere, her eyes apologizing for something she hadn't done. Darius nodded as Susan placed the glass gently on his tray table. Meredith pushed the cart forward without another word, her back stiff as she continued down the aisle. The glass was cold against Darius's palm. He sipped it slowly, but the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. It wasn't about the water. It never was. Passengers returned to their routines, though the silence still hung in the air. Darius could feel it, the lingering discomfort of having witnessed something unspoken yet unmistakable. He leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window as the clouds stretched endlessly into the horizon. Injustice rarely arrives with grand declarations or flashing lights. More often than not, it comes quietly, disguised as something small: a cup of water, a delayed service, a glance that lingers too long. But it's never as small as it seems. And Darius knew, even now, that the ripple of this moment would continue long after the plane touched down. Darius sipped the water slowly, letting the coolness settle against the back of his throat. But it did little to extinguish the fire rising in his chest. The cabin returned to a fragile rhythm, but the quiet was deceptive. He felt it, that undercurrent, that tension winding itself tighter with each passing minute. This wasn't over. It wasn't something that would simply dissolve into the recycled air of the plane. Meredith had moved to the rear, her back a rigid line as she busied herself with tasks that no one had asked for. She rearranged drink napkins, refolded blankets, anything to avoid walking near Darius's row again. But avoidance wasn't enough to undo what had already taken root. A few rows up, the woman who had been watching earlier shifted in her seat, her eyes flickering toward Darius before darting away. She wasn't alone. Several other passengers had begun to notice the absence of normalcy, their gazes quietly measuring the space between him and Meredith. They saw it now. Maybe they didn't have the words for it, but they saw it. Darius reclined his seat slightly, resting his head back against the cushion. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding people like him. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket, a reminder of the world that waited for him after the flight. But for now, he ignored it. There was no escaping the reality in front of him. As the plane drifted through the clouds, the seatbelt sign flickered on. A voice from the cockpit came over the intercom, smooth but distant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be hitting a patch of turbulence shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Darius pulled his belt snug, eyes shifting toward the aisle. Meredith re-emerged, strolling toward the front with the calm assurance of someone who didn't believe she had done anything wrong. She stopped by an elderly couple seated ahead of Darius. Her voice honeyed as she crouched slightly to speak to them. He caught fragments of her words, soft jokes about the turbulence, reassurances delivered with an easy charm. Darius clenched his jaw. He wasn't surprised. She knew how to perform when the right audience was watching. But when she straightened and began walking again, her gaze slid past Darius's row as if the seat beside him were empty. A deliberate forgetting. And that was the most dangerous kind of hostility, the kind wrapped in a smile. The kind you couldn't hold in your hands because it slipped through your fingers like smoke. The turbulence arrived with a slow roll, rattling the cabin. Darius let out a slow breath, steadying himself as the plane shook lightly beneath him. It was then that Meredith's voice echoed from the front of the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, please remain seated until the captain switches off the seatbelt sign." It was standard procedure, routine. But something about the way she said it made Darius's skin prickle. Her eyes found his for the briefest second, and there it was, that flicker of power, of control she wasn't ready to relinquish. Darius shifted, sitting upright. It was subtle, but he knew it now. She wanted him to stay quiet. That's how these things usually went. You let it slide, you rationalized it, and before long, You found yourself shrinking beneath the weight of all the times you chose not to make waves. But Darius had learned long ago that shrinking didn't save you. It only made you easier to overlook. He pressed the call button again. The light blinked softly above him. And this time, the shift in the cabin was immediate. Passengers who had spent the last hour pretending not to notice suddenly couldn't help but look. Across the aisle, the woman with the movies stared openly now, her hand resting against her tray table as if to steady herself. The man beside Darius shifted in his seat, coughing lightly. Darius kept his eyes forward, unwavering, and then Meredith appeared, the tension between them almost palpable. "Yes?" she asked, voice clipped. "I need another glass of water," Darius said, though his first glass remained half full on his tray. Meredith's lips tightened. "Is there a problem?" Darius let the question hang in the air for a moment longer than necessary. "No," he replied slowly. "I just need water." Meredith's eyes narrowed, but there was something else beneath her frustration now, something brittle. As if she understood that this was no longer a quiet battle. Passengers were watching, and suddenly, the small power she wielded felt fragile in her hands. "I'll bring it when I can," she said, her voice lower this time, as if the edge of her authority was beginning to dull. "Thank you," Darius replied, settling back into his seat without breaking eye contact. She turned sharply, retreating toward the galley, but Darius could see the ripple in her composure. It wasn't just about water. It was about the cracks forming in the facade. The quiet shift that happens when people begin to notice the things they've been trained to ignore. A few rows up, the elderly man she had spoken to earlier turned slightly in his seat, glancing toward Darius with something that felt almost like recognition. And slowly, the plane returned to its uneasy silence. But Darius knew some things. Once seen, couldn't be unseen. The plane leveled out, the turbulence dissolving into the steady hum of the engines. But in the cabin, the storm had just begun. Darius sat still, fingers resting against the armrest, the cool glass of water untouched before him. It wasn't thirst that drove him now, it was the need to see this through. To refuse the familiar quiet that often followed moments like this. Meredith hadn't returned since their last exchange. He could feel the weight of that absence. It stretched out across the cabin like a shadow, curling in the spaces between passengers who were suddenly too aware of the tension and too hesitant to name it. It would have been easy to let it end there. Easy to sip the water he already had. Fold himself neatly into the role that was so often assigned to him, the polite black man who doesn't make trouble. Who lets things slide. Who prioritizes comfort, even when it isn't his own. But easy didn't mean right. A voice tugged at the back of Darius's mind, his father's. Soft but unrelenting. "Sometimes you're not fighting for today. You're fighting for every day that comes after it." He pressed the button again. A soft chime echoed overhead. The third time. This wasn't about water anymore. And everyone in that cabin understood it. He didn't turn to gauge their reactions. He didn't need to. He could feel the ripple expanding outward, tightening the air like a rope being drawn taut. Meredith appeared a minute later. Her steps slower now, her eyes flicking toward the front of the cabin as if hoping someone else might intervene before she reached his row. No one did. She stopped beside him, her hand resting on the edge of the seat in front of his. "I thought I told you I'd get to it," she said, voice low but tight, trying to contain the heat that had begun to rise between them. "You did," Darius replied, his tone unwavering. "And yet, I'm still waiting." For a moment, they stared at each other, the space between them shrinking under the weight of everything unspoken. The woman across the aisle no longer pretended to watch her movie. The elderly man 2 rows ahead had set his book aside. Even the flight attendant, Susan, lingered further down the aisle, her eyes carefully observing from behind the drink cart. Meredith's jaw clenched, but Darius could see the flicker of doubt creeping into her expression. "What exactly is it you want?" she asked, a sharpness slipping through the polished veneer she had tried so hard to maintain. Darius leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice calm, steady. "Respect." The word settled into the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Meredith stiffened, her eyes darted toward the other passengers, as if searching for some unspoken approval, some silent agreement that would affirm she had the right to treat him this way. But the silence was no longer on her side. "Mr. Hayes." A new voice broke through the air, measured, authoritative. Darius glanced up to see a man in a navy suit approaching from the front of the plane. The flight crew's insignia shimmered faintly on his shoulder. A senior flight supervisor, judging by the crispness of his uniform and the careful way he carried himself. "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, his eyes moving between Darius and Meredith. Darius could see the shift in Meredith's posture, the subtle straightening of her shoulders, the way she stepped slightly to the side as if positioning herself under the protection of protocol. "No problem," Darius replied, locking eyes with the supervisor. "I asked for water, that's all." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, sharpened by the weight of everything that had led to this point. The supervisor's gaze flicked briefly toward Meredith, and something passed between them, something silent but unmistakable. "Of course," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Let me handle it." Meredith hesitated for a breath, her eyes lingering on Darius for a moment longer before she stepped back. Retreating toward the rear of the plane, the supervisor bent slightly, setting a fresh glass of water on Darius's tray table with a quiet precision. "My apologies for the delay," he said softly. Darius nodded but said nothing, watching as the supervisor turned and disappeared back toward the front of the plane. The tension in the cabin began to dissipate, but not entirely. It lingered, an echo of what had just transpired, a reminder that the smallest confrontations often held the deepest weight. As the minutes passed, Darius could feel the subtle shifts around him, the way passengers adjusted in their seats, the quiet murmurs exchanged behind cupped hands. But no one looked away. And that, he knew, was its own form of progress. A few rows ahead, the elderly man caught his eye and gave a small nod. A quiet acknowledgement. Darius returned it, the corner of his mouth curling into something that wasn't quite a smile but felt close enough. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about the cracks in the facade, the small ruptures that made room for something better to grow. And as the plane soared steadily through the clouds, Darius leaned back into his seat, knowing that today, he had left one of those cracks behind. Darius watched the supervisor disappear down the aisle, the glass of water sitting untouched on his tray. The cabin had fallen back into an uneasy rhythm. But the silence between the passengers wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the silence that comes when people are waiting for something to break. For the next moment to tip the fragile balance of power that had been tested and nearly shattered. Meredith hadn't returned to his section. She had lingered in the back of the plane, her absence louder than any words she could have spoken. But Darius knew this wasn't the end. It never ends this clean. The thing about these moments, their danger lies in their quiet aftermath. The tightrope walk after the fall. He had learned this lesson many times before. Confrontation rarely closes the book. It simply starts a new chapter. And the real test is whether the old patterns will creep back in before the ink dries. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending to lose themselves in their books or screens. But their attention betrayed them. Darius could feel their eyes flicking toward him. Some with curiosity, others with a quiet solidarity that they didn't quite know how to express. Across the aisle, the woman who had been watching from the beginning finally spoke. "You handled that well," she said softly, offering a faint smile. Darius glanced at her, nodding once. "Didn't feel like it. It never does," she replied. "But you made her show herself. That counts for something." Before Darius could respond, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent in approximately 30 minutes. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened as we prepare for landing." The end of the flight was nearing, but Darius felt no relief. Instead, the cabin grew smaller, the weight of what had happened pressing inward. He sensed it before he saw her. Meredith emerged from the galley, her eyes sharp, her shoulders stiff. She walked with purpose this time, but there was no warmth to it. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trying to disguise the crack in her facade anymore. This wasn't over. She stopped just short of his row, her hand resting on the top of the seat in front of him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice low but firm, "I need to ask you to keep your behavior in check for the remainder of the flight." Darius lifted his eyes slowly to meet hers. "Excuse me? You've made your point," she continued, her tone tightening like a coil winding itself too tight. "But I won't tolerate further disruptions. If you press that call button again without a valid reason, I will have to report it to the captain." Her words hung in the air like smoke, curling in the corners of the cabin and suffocating the space between them. It was a threat. Soft, polite, but unmistakably a threat. Darius sat up straighter, his fingers curling lightly around the armrests. The passengers around him tensed, eyes flicking nervously from Meredith to him and back again. He could see it, how she was trying to reclaim the power she felt she had lost. How she wanted to remind him, and everyone else, of the hierarchy that had been subtly reinforced for generations. Darius wasn't surprised, but he was tired. So very tired. "Let me ask you something," Darius said quietly, keeping his gaze locked with hers. What part of asking for a glass of water was disruptive? Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not the point," she snapped, her professionalism slipping. "You know exactly what I mean." Darius let the silence stretch out between them. He wasn't interested in helping her explain herself. But someone else was. "That's enough." It was the elderly man 2 rows ahead, the one who had been quietly observing but hadn't spoken until now. His voice carried the authority of someone who had lived long enough to recognize injustice when he saw it. Meredith turned toward him, startled. "I saw the whole thing," the man continued, leaning slightly over the seat. "This gentleman asked for water. That's all. And I watched you walk past him 3 times. So if there's a disruption here, I'd say it's not coming from him." A ripple of agreement spread subtly through the cabin. Passengers murmured quietly, nodding along with the man's words. Meredith's face tightened, the color draining from her cheeks. Darius didn't speak. He didn't need to. The plane wasn't on his side. But the truth wasn't for now. That was enough. Meredith inhaled sharply, her eyes narrowing in frustration. But she must have known she was outnumbered. Because without another word, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed back toward the galley. The cabin exhaled. The elderly man caught Darius's eye once more, nodding again before settling back into his seat. Darius felt the tension in his shoulders release. But the weight in his chest remained. Because this wasn't about water. And it wasn't even about Meredith. It was about something far older, something that lived in the bones of the country they were flying over. Darius glanced at the glass on his tray. The ice melting slowly inside it. He would drink it eventually. But not yet. He let it sit there, untouched. As the plane continued its slow descent toward the ground, the plane dipped lower, skimming the edges of the clouds as the lights of the city flickered faintly beneath them. Darius could feel the descent, not just in the shift of altitude but in the tightening air around him. The cabin wasn't just quiet, it was bracing. The confrontation with Meredith had ended in words. But the silence left in its wake felt dangerous. As if the cabin itself now hung in delicate balance. Everyone sensed it. The passengers, the crew, even the hum of the engines seemed to carry it. Darius leaned back in his seat. His body still but his mind racing. This wasn't new. The faces changed. The settings evolved. But the undercurrent was the same, a slow unraveling of patience. The deliberate reminder that no matter how high he climbed, there were always those who believed he didn't belong. Meredith's threat had come wrapped in professionalism. But underneath, it was raw and familiar. It was the same voice that had followed him through hotel lobbies, department stores, even sidewalks at night, a voice that didn't need to shout to make itself heard. "Stay in your place." Darius wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or defiance that held him in his seat now. Maybe it was both. He glanced at the glass of water, still sitting half full on his tray. Beads of condensation sliding down the sides. It seemed absurd that something so simple had become a symbol. A catalyst for unraveling the facade of the flight. Across the aisle, the woman who had spoken earlier shifted again, watching him carefully. There was something in her eyes, sympathy. Maybe, but also a silent question. Would he press the button again? Would he stand up? Wasn't that the question everyone was waiting to have answered? Meredith appeared once more, her steps brisk as she passed through the aisle. She didn't look at Darius. But he could feel the heat rolling off her, simmering beneath the surface of her rigid poise. She had been humiliated, and humiliation has a way of curdling into something worse. Darius's father used to say that pride, especially wounded pride, was the thin edge of the blade that cut the deepest. It wasn't the fight itself that you needed to worry about. It was what came afterward. When anger found a quiet place to grow. He knew that whatever was brewing in Meredith wasn't finished. He saw it in the way she moved faster now, collecting trash with a little more force than necessary, avoiding his row with sharp precision. It wasn't over, and he could feel the cabin tightening in response to it. The elderly man who had spoken up earlier had gone back to reading. But his eyes lifted every time Meredith walked by. his gaze tracing her movements like a silent sentinel. Susan, the second flight attendant, lingered near the galley, her eyes catching Darius's from time to time. There was concern in her face, but also hesitation. She was part of the same machine that Meredith was, and Darius could tell she wasn't sure how far her loyalty extended. The descent continued, each minute stretching longer than the one before it. Darius shifted, pulling his phone from his pocket, unlocking the screen out of habit more than necessity. A message flashed from his colleague, a simple check-in about the business meetings he had left behind. It felt distant now. As he lowered the phone back to his lap, he caught Meredith pausing near the front of the plane. She wasn't doing anything, not really, just standing there, eyes scanning the cabin with a cold detachment. But then, she did something small, something calculated. She spoke quietly to the supervisor, leaning in just enough that no one else could hear. Darius's stomach tightened. The supervisor's eyes flicked in Darius's direction, narrowing slightly before nodding. It was subtle, but Darius had seen enough boardrooms and backhanded strategies to recognize what was happening. She wasn't finished with him. Darius exhaled, steadying himself. He wasn't a fool. He knew how easily things like this could spiral, how the wrong word or misstep could be twisted into a justification. Meredith was laying the groundwork, planting seeds of doubt that would bloom by the time the plane touched down. This was no longer just about water. It was about narrative, and whoever controlled that narrative would determine how this ended. Darius could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him. But he didn't move. Let her build whatever story she wanted. He had the truth, and sometimes, that was enough to break the blade before it could cut. As the seatbelt sign flickered on, the finality of the descent settling in, Darius straightened his posture. The flight would land soon, but he could sense the last confrontation brewing. The air had thickened, and Meredith wasn't done yet. The wheels of the plane groaned softly as the descent deepened, and with each passing second, the tension in the cabin thickened like fog rolling in before a storm. Darius could feel it pressing down on him, heavy, invisible, but undeniable. Meredith still hadn't returned to his row. She hovered near the front of the plane, exchanging words with the supervisor in hushed tones that didn't need to be loud to be dangerous. Her gestures were subtle, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, but Darius knew better. This was a performance. She was building something with each quiet exchange, weaving a narrative that would serve her once the plane touched the ground. It wasn't about what had happened anymore, it was about the version of events she wanted to exist. That was how it always worked. Darius had seen it countless times in rooms full of men in tailored suits. Men who smiled as they closed doors behind him, who twisted discomfort into accusations and silence into guilt. Now, it was happening again, 30,000 feet in the air. But the script hadn't changed. Across the aisle, the woman who had spoken to him earlier sat rigid, her eyes flicking nervously between Darius and the front of the plane. The elderly man 2 rows ahead lowered his book slightly, listening more than reading now. Everyone could feel it. It was like waiting for a crack in the ice beneath their feet. Meredith's eyes finally met Darius's as she walked past, slow and deliberate, her gaze lingering for a breath too long. She didn't stop. She didn't speak. But that look, it wasn't warning him anymore. It was promising. Darius tightened his grip on the armrest, inhaling slowly to steady himself. The cabin felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in inch by inch. And then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'll be touching down in approximately 10 minutes. Cabin crew, please prepare for landing." The final stretch. Darius sat back, eyes fixed on the glass of water still sitting on his tray. He hadn't touched it since Susan brought it to him. Not once. He didn't know why, perhaps out of stubbornness or perhaps because it had become something else entirely. A reminder of all the small moments that had led to this one. The wheels lowered beneath them with a soft thud, and Meredith moved through the aisle once more, securing overhead bins and straightening seatbelts. But she was working toward something. When she reached his row, she paused, her fingers curling around the headrest of the seat in front of him. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, her voice a weapon sheathed in politeness. "When we land, I'll need to ask you to remain seated while the rest of the passengers disembark." Darius's heart skipped, but his face didn't move. "Why is that?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. "There's been a report of disruptive behavior," she replied smoothly, her eyes cold but steady. "We'd like to resolve it before you leave the plane." The cabin felt like it had stopped breathing. Darius could feel every pair of eyes on him now. No one said a word. For a moment, he considered letting it pass, letting her build the narrative and defend himself later. When the ground felt solid beneath his feet. But he'd played that part before. Not today. Darius's voice didn't rise, but there was steel beneath it. "You've walked past this row at least 10 times since I asked for water," he said, holding her gaze with the steady weight of truth. "You didn't stop to ask if I needed anything. You didn't stop to confirm whether I was disruptive. But now that the plane is about to land, suddenly there's a concern?" Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm doing my job," she replied stiffly. "No," Darius said, sitting forward slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're protecting your pride." Meredith's eyes flickered with something sharp: anger, fear, maybe both. But before she could speak, the elderly man 2 rows ahead turned in his seat. "I saw what happened," he said clearly, his voice louder than the hum of the engines. "This man hasn't been disruptive. He's been more patient than most of us would be." A murmur swept through the cabin, quiet but unmistakable. Susan, standing near the galley, glanced nervously toward the front of the plane but didn't interrupt. Darius's eyes never left Meredith's. Her face flushed, the color creeping up her neck. But she said nothing. Instead, she straightened, smoothing the front of her uniform with trembling hands. "I'll speak with the captain," she muttered, stepping away quickly, her shoes clicking sharply against the floor. The tension didn't ease, but the tide had shifted. Passengers whispered softly, some nodding toward Darius in silent recognition. As the plane prepared for landing, Darius finally lifted the glass of water to his lips, letting the coolness wash over him. It tasted bitter, but it wasn't about the water. It never was. The plane drifted lower, skimming the edges of the runway. But inside the cabin, the descent felt far from over. Darius sat still, the faint taste of water lingering on his tongue, though it did nothing to ease the weight pressing down on his chest. His eyes stayed forward, calm but alert, tracing the curve of the seat in front of him. He knew what was coming. The elderly man who had spoken up for him settled back in his seat. But his gaze didn't waver. He wasn't reading anymore. The book lay open on his lap, his thumb resting lightly on the spine, as if holding the page wasn't for him but for the shape of the moment itself marking it, not allowing it to pass unnoticed. Darius appreciated that, but appreciation wasn't armor. Meredith had vanished toward the cockpit, her absence leaving behind something heavier than her presence ever had. It lingered like static, a thin, unspoken charge that refused to dissipate. Passengers whispered in low murmurs now, quiet enough to avoid attention but loud enough to feel like small waves lapping at the edges of the fragile silence. Darius had felt this before: the lingering, quiet expectation. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one knew who would carry it when the wheels touched the ground. A soft thud jolted the plane as it made contact with the runway, bouncing slightly before settling into a slow, steady roll. The overhead bins rattled faintly, the landing gear groaning under the weight of arrival. But Darius didn't feel grounded. His grip on the armrest relaxed just slightly, but not enough to let his guard fall completely. He caught Susan's eye from across the cabin. She didn't look away this time. Her lips pressed into a thin, uncomfortable line, and he could see the conflict written plainly across her face. She wanted to say something, but wanting and doing often lived on different shores. The intercom buzzed, and the captain's voice washed over the cabin, calm and rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. We'll be taxiing to the gate shortly. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." The routine words felt distant, hollow. Darius's eyes shifted to the front of the plane, watching as the supervisor emerged from the cockpit. Meredith followed close behind, her posture straighter than before, shoulders squared like someone readying for battle. This wasn't over. The supervisor's gaze scanned the cabin briefly before he walked toward the front row, speaking quietly to one of the passengers. Meredith stayed near the exit, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes darting toward Darius like she was counting the seconds until she could reclaim the upper hand. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and passengers began reaching for their bags, moving in soft bursts of motion that didn't match the undercurrent of tension still winding through the air. Darius remained seated. So did the elderly man. And so did the woman across the aisle. No one moved to leave his row. Meredith stepped forward then, her voice calm but sharpened. "Mr. Hayes," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I'll need you to stay seated while others disembark." Darius held her gaze, searching for the flicker of satisfaction he knew she was trying to hide beneath the surface of her professionalism. But he wasn't interested in giving her what she wanted. He leaned back slowly, folding his hands in his lap, and nodded. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied softly, but the strength behind his words rippled outward like a stone dropped into water. The elderly man glanced toward him, and without turning around, he raised his voice just slightly enough for Meredith to hear. "If he stays, I stay." Meredith's expression tightened. A few murmurs spread through the cabin, passengers exchanging subtle glances, but no one else rose. Darius could see it now, her unease growing with every second that passed. The performance unraveling beneath the quiet defiance that filled the row. Susan stepped forward suddenly, her eyes locking with Meredith's. "I'll stay as well," she said, her voice gentle but firm. For the first time, Meredith faltered. The facade cracked just slightly. And for one brief moment, Darius thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, something fragile, uncertain, but she swallowed it down quickly, turning on her heel and disappearing toward the galley without another word. Darius exhaled quietly, feeling the weight in his chest ease, not completely, but enough to know that he wasn't carrying this moment alone. Passengers slowly filed past, their gazes lingering as they shuffled toward the exit. Some avoided eye contact, while others nodded discreetly, offering silent acknowledgement. Darius met each gaze with the same quiet steadiness. This wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was resistance. And sometimes, that was enough to make the ground beneath you feel just a little more solid. The cabin emptied row by row. But Darius remained seated, his posture calm and unmoving, as if rising would somehow betray the principle he had found himself anchored to. The plane hummed beneath him, its slow taxi to the gate almost serene. But he could feel the storm gathering in the distance. Meredith lingered near the galley, pretending to review her clipboard. But Darius saw the way her eyes flicked in his direction every few moments. She was waiting for him to blink. Passengers squeezed past her on their way out. But no one could ignore the way she stood, a quiet blockade between Darius and the open air of the terminal. Susan stayed nearby, her presence an unspoken line Meredith couldn't cross without consequence. The elderly man, too, sat firm, gazing out the window as though he had all the time in the world. Darius felt the tension begin to coil around his chest once more. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was sharp. Meredith's mask had begun to slip. And Darius knew exactly what that meant. Her pride was not built to withstand the quiet, unflinching gaze of truth for long. He had seen people like her before, people who mistook silence for submission, who thought patience was the same as passivity. They carried themselves with the certainty that authority would always bend in their favor, that the story belonged to them simply because they were the first to write it. But what happens when that authority falters? What happens when the people you expect to shrink refuse to move? Darius was curious to see how far Meredith would let this unravel. The plane finally came to a stop at the gate, the familiar chime signaling the end of the flight. Overhead bins creaked open, and the last of the passengers trickled out, their eyes lingering a little too long on the tableau unfolding in the middle of first class. Darius could feel the quiet solidarity stitched between him, the elderly man, and Susan. But solidarity, he knew, wasn't always enough to stop what came next. Meredith stepped forward, clearing her throat softly. Her voice, when it arrived, was laced with that same thinly veiled authority she had been wielding since the start. "Mr. Hayes," she began, smoothing her hands over her uniform, "I've spoken with the captain, and it's protocol that we address your behavior once the flight has concluded. If you'd like, I can escort you to the gate agent to avoid further delay." Her words dripped with manufactured courtesy. But Darius heard the steel beneath them. This was the moment where she would try to reclaim control, not through direct confrontation, but by positioning herself as the voice of reason, by turning his quiet resistance into disruption. Darius leaned back in his seat, letting the weight of her words settle between them. He knew the game, but he had no intention of playing it. "I'm comfortable right here," Darius replied, his tone calm but immovable. Meredith's mouth tightened, but before she could respond, the elderly man beside him shifted forward, planting both feet firmly on the floor. "If he stays," the man said. "I stay." Meredith's eyes snapped toward him, frustration flashing across her face for the briefest moment. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "I think it does," he interrupted, his voice rising just enough to catch Susan's attention. "I watched what happened. I heard every word, and if this man needs to stay behind, I'll gladly sit with him." Darius could see Meredith's composure fraying. Thread by thread, her authority was slipping, and she knew it. Susan stepped closer, folding her arms gently across her chest. "I'll stay as well," she said, her eyes locking onto Meredith's with quiet defiance. It was a simple statement, unassuming, but the balance shifted in that moment. It wasn't just Darius sitting there anymore. It was three of them. Meredith's jaw tightened, and Darius could see the war raging behind her eyes, the desperate scramble to find footing where none remained. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Meredith said finally, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "No," Darius said, rising slowly to his feet, his eyes meeting hers with the full weight of everything left unspoken. "I'm making it exactly as hard as it needs to be." The cabin fell into a breathless silence. And for the first time since this began, Meredith didn't have an answer. Darius gathered his things, stepping carefully into the aisle, his movements deliberate but steady. Susan and the elderly man rose with him, trailing just a step behind, as if to ensure no shadow remained between him and the open gate. Meredith stood frozen in place, watching them pass, her hands clenching into tight fists at her sides. But she said nothing. There are moments when the world shifts not because of grand gestures, but because the weight of injustice becomes too heavy for silence to carry. As Darius stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air of the terminal washing over him, he knew this wasn't victory. Victory was far away, but today, he had held the line. And sometimes, that was enough. The cool air of the jet bridge struck Darius like the first breath after being submerged underwater for too long. The quiet hum of the terminal stretched ahead, distant but steady, grounding him as he stepped forward with careful, deliberate ease. But the weight of the cabin did not stay behind him. It followed, clinging to the edges of his thoughts like a shadow that refused to recede. Even under the bright fluorescent lights of the airport, Susan walked a step behind him, and the elderly man stayed close as if proximity itself might ensure the truth of what had unfolded wouldn't be swallowed by the world beyond the plane. Darius felt their presence like scaffolding, holding him upright in the places where exhaustion had begun to creep in. Meredith hadn't followed. She had let him pass. But the memory of her glare felt like something sharp grazing the back of his neck. He could feel her watching, even as the automatic doors of the terminal slid open and the three of them emerged into the stream of waiting passengers. No one paid them much attention, just three travelers making their way toward baggage claim. But Darius knew better. The story didn't end when the doors opened. It never did. "Mr. Hayes." Darius turned to find the elderly man standing beside him, his hand outstretched. "I didn't get your name," Darius said, shaking his hand firmly. "Bill Everett," the man replied. "I couldn't just sit there and say nothing. We've let too much of that pass for too long." Darius nodded, but there was something else behind his eyes, gratitude mixed with a weariness that couldn't be spoken aloud. "Thank you, Bill," he said, his voice low. "That meant more than you know." Bill smiled faintly, but his eyes held the weight of years. "I think I know," he replied. Susan shifted beside them, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I should have stepped in sooner." Darius met her gaze, searching for the right words. He saw the discomfort written in the tightness of her posture, the way her shoulders sagged under the burden of her silence. "You stepped in," Darius said, holding her gaze. "That's more than most." Susan nodded, though the apology lingered between them like unfinished business. Bill glanced around the terminal, his eyes narrowing slightly toward the gate they had left behind. "Do you think she'll try something after we leave?" he asked, his voice low. Darius exhaled slowly. "She might," he admitted, "but the moment passed. She knows it." Bill grunted softly. "I hope you're right. Women like that," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "They don't take losing lightly." "No, they don't," Darius agreed. The three of them stood there for a moment longer, as if reluctant to dissolve the fragile alliance that had formed between them. Eventually, Bill nodded toward the escalators leading to baggage claim. Well, I suppose I should get moving. Long drive ahead of me. Safe travels. Bill, Darius said, shaking his hand once more. You too, Mr. Hayes. Bill disappeared down the escalator, leaving Darius and Susan standing in the glow of the terminal lights. I should get back to my crew, Susan said softly, but I wanted to thank you for not letting it slide. Darius smiled faintly, though there was no real warmth in it. I didn't do anything special, he replied. I just didn't sit still. Susan hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but instead, she nodded and turned away, leaving Darius alone. The terminal stretched ahead, bright and bustling, but Darius felt the weight of the cabin pressing against him still. It wasn't over. It never really was. These moments, these small collisions of pride, prejudice, and resistance had a way of lingering long after the confrontation itself had ended. But Darius wasn't carrying the weight of it alone. He felt the ripple of it, the quiet shift in the air that came when people like Bill chose to stand instead of sit. When flight attendants like Susan found their voices even after hesitation. The change was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and sometimes, that was enough to keep walking. Darius adjusted the strap on his shoulder bag and moved forward, disappearing into the crowd, his footsteps steady against the polished floor. Darius moved through the terminal with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knew the weight of being watched. The hum of airport life bustled around him, families reuniting. Briefcases clutched tightly by men in suits. Children yawning as they clung to their mothers' hands. But Darius wasn't part of that rhythm. His steps were quieter, as if careful not to disturb the delicate space he occupied, a space where people like him were always noticed. Even when they weren't supposed to be. He could feel it now. The same way he had felt it when he was a boy standing in a store too long. Or when he sat in a boardroom filled with polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes. The truth about America, Darius thought, was that it didn't like to look at itself too closely. But it had a habit of glancing sideways at men like him just long enough to remind them that no matter how high they climbed, the ground was never far away. As he approached baggage claim, the crowd began to thin. But that feeling, that tightening in the chest, did not. It clung to him like static. Then he saw her, Meredith. She stood near the exit, partially obscured by the shadow of a column. She wasn't in uniform anymore. But Darius recognized her immediately. The stiff posture, the set of her jaw, there was no mistaking it. She hadn't followed him, not physically, but she had chosen to place herself there. A presence lingering at the edge of his awareness like a ghost that refused to be dismissed. Their eyes met across the room. She didn't look away. Darius's hands flexed at his sides. He didn't change his stride. But his heart began to beat faster. There it was, the moment he had been waiting for. Because this was how it always unfolded. It wasn't enough for Meredith to lose the battle in the air. She needed to reclaim the space she believed was hers. Even if it was only for a fleeting moment. Even now, when the plane had long since landed, she needed to remind him that she was still there. Darius approached the conveyor belt, his gaze unwavering as he pulled his bag from the carousel. But Meredith didn't move. She was waiting for something. Or maybe she was hoping he would be the one to break, hoping he would storm over and give her the confrontation she had been denied in front of the passengers. But Darius wasn't going to give her that. Instead, he turned, meeting her gaze head-on as if to say, I see you. For a long moment, neither of them moved, but the power had shifted. And Meredith knew it. Her shoulders tensed, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Then, without a word, she turned and slipped through the exit. Darius exhaled slowly. He should have felt victorious. But the sensation that settled in his chest wasn't pride. It was exhaustion. Because this was the part that no one talked about, the quiet battle after the battle. It wasn't the loud confrontations that wore a man down. It was the way the world insisted on pressing itself against him. The way it whispered, don't think you've won anything. He adjusted the strap of his bag and made his way toward the exit. His shoulders squared but his heart heavy. The air outside was cool against his skin as he stepped into the night. But even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that Meredith's shadow was still trailing behind him. Because the truth was, the world didn't let go of men like him so easily. And somewhere deep down, Darius knew that Meredith wasn't gone. Not really. She was part of something larger, something that lived in the cracks and corners of the world. Watching and waiting. But as Darius walked toward the taxi stand, He reminded himself of something else his father used to say. You may carry this weight, but you don't carry it alone. And as the door to the cab opened, Darius let that truth settle around him like armor. The city lights streaked past the window as the cab rolled through the streets. But Darius barely saw them. The hum of the tires against the pavement, the soft murmurs of the radio, it all blurred into something distant and hollow. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but restless. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Meredith's silhouette standing in the airport's glow, watching him from the curb. She wasn't there, but her absence didn't bring him comfort. It never ended that cleanly. The driver glanced at him through the mirror, sensing the weight in the cab's backseat but choosing not to disturb it. There was a certain wisdom in that one that came with time. With age, Darius let the silence stretch, though his thoughts twisted tighter with every block they passed. He knew he hadn't seen the last of Meredith. Women like her didn't need to chase you down in the open. They existed in the quiet corners of the world, moving like shadows pressing in through systems, through polite phone calls made behind closed doors, through reports filed with the faint suggestion that perhaps he had been the problem all along. That was the real danger. Meredith didn't need to win in front of witnesses. She just needed to plant the seed of doubt. And doubt, Darius knew, was a stubborn thing. It grew in the spaces where silence lingered, where truth was too fragile to hold its shape. He thought back to the flight, the moments that had led to this. It wasn't about the glass of water. It was never about the glass of water. The weight he carried now wasn't just his own. It was the accumulation of every moment before it, every stare that lasted too long, every door that didn't open, every conversation that shifted when he walked into the room. It was the inheritance of a burden that stretched back generations. His father had carried it, his grandfather before him, and now, it sat in the seat beside him, as familiar as an old friend. The cab slowed at a red light, and for a brief moment, Darius's reflection stared back at him from the window. He saw the lines around his eyes, the ones that hadn't been there 10 years ago. The light turned green, but the reflection stayed with him. You good back there? The driver asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Darius blinked, the reflection dissolving into the passing streets. I'm good, Darius replied, though the words felt heavier than they should have. But the driver didn't press further. He just nodded and let the silence settle back in. As the cab neared his building, Darius felt his phone buzz softly in his pocket. He ignored it at first, but by the time the cab pulled to the curb, the buzzing returned, persistent, unwilling to be brushed aside. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Darius let the phone ring. He knew who it was. Maybe not by name, but he knew the shape of it. It was the echo of the airport. The shadow that followed him home. Meredith's voice, or someone's like it, waiting on the other end of the line. The voicemail notification blinked softly as he paid the driver and stepped out into the cool night air. Darius didn't play the message. Not yet. Instead, he stood there for a moment, staring up at the building's facade, letting the city's rhythm wash over him. The battle was over, but the war, the quiet, endless war, was still humming beneath the surface. As it always did, but Darius knew something that Meredith didn't. She had tried to plant doubt, but he had planted something else. A crack. Small, perhaps invisible to most, but real. And cracks, if left alone long enough, had a way of growing. He stepped inside, the weight of the day pressing against his shoulders. But his stride was steady. Meredith's voice may follow him, but so would Bill's, so would Susan's. And in a world that so often insisted on silence, Darius knew that even the faintest echo of resistance could be deafening. As the elevator doors slid shut behind him, Darius let out a slow breath. Tonight, the weight was heavy, but he wasn't carrying it alone.